The floor manager had been watching through the window, his face the color of old newspaper sweat stains spreading across his shirt like continents forming on a map of anxiety. His eyes were wide pupils, dilated with a panic that Marcus recognized immediately as the look of someone watching their career collapse in real time. Mr. Hall, his voice cracked on the name splitting into two syllables that shouldn't have been separate. A word outside. Now. Marcus followed him into the hallway, feeling every pair of eyes in that private dining room, tracking his departure like searchlights following an escaped prisoner. The weight of those gazes pressed against his back, curiosity and shock and judgment blending into something almost physical. He walked with his spine straight, his steps measured, refusing to hurry or show any sign that he understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. The hallway outside the private dining room existed in a different universe, from the carefully curated elegance visible to paying customers. Here the carpet was industrial grade rather than plush, the walls painted institutional beige rather than designer gray. This was backstage, the machinery that made the fantasy possible, stripped of pretense and reduced to function. Gerald paced in tight, frantic circles, his movements jerky and uncontrolled, hands running through what little remained of his hair. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the fluorescent lights, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that suggested either a panic attack or something close to it. When he finally stopped moving and turned to face Marcus, his expression carried the particular horror of someone who had just witnessed a natural disaster and knew more destruction was coming. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The words emerged as a hiss, barely controlled volume reduced by force of will rather than lack of intensity. That woman could buy this entire restaurant and fire every single one of us before she finishes her breakfast tomorrow morning. She could make one phone call, just one, and you would never work in this city again. In any city. Marcus stood with his hands clasped behind his back, willing his pounding heart to slow, forcing his breathing to remain steady. His entire body thrummed with adrenaline, the chemical aftermath of confrontation flooding his system and making his fingers want to shake. But he kept his voice calm when he responded, proud that it came out level despite the chaos churning inside him. "She insulted me in a language she thought I didn't understand. She called me useless, said I was only fit for manual labor. She insulted my daughter Gerald. Called me pathetic for being a single father trying to provide for his child." Gerald's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further, his features arranging themselves into lines that Marcus recognized from 4 years of service industry hierarchy. This was the face of someone about to make a sacrifice, calculating the cost of protecting one employee against the cost of appeasing one customer, whose displeasure could destroy everything. "And you responded." Gerald's voice climbed towards something approaching hysteria, control slipping with each word. "You actually responded. You were supposed to apologize, Hall. You were supposed to bow and scrape and thank her for the incredible privilege of being humiliated in a language you weren't supposed to understand. That's how this works. That's how it has always worked. Then maybe how it works is wrong." The words came out quieter than Marcus intended, but they carried weight that volume couldn't match. He watched something flicker across Gerald's face, some emotion that might have been agreement or sympathy or simply exhaustion with a system that ground down everyone at touch, management and staff alike. Gerald stopped his frantic movement and stared at Marcus as though seeing him for the first time, as though the person standing before him was a stranger wearing a familiar face. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, the tone someone might use when delivering terrible news to a child. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Go home. I'll call you if we figure out how to handle the aftermath of this disaster." Suspended. The word landed with the weight of inevitability, the confirmation of something Marcus had known was coming from the moment he opened his mouth in that dining room. But hearing it spoken aloud transformed possibility into reality, consequence into fact. "It's the best I can do and probably more than you deserve." Gerald's words continued gaining momentum now that the decision had been made. If she complains when she complains, the owners are going to demand blood. They'll want someone fired, someone punished, someone's head on a platter to show that they take her concerns seriously. Consider this me trying to protect whatever's left of your career by giving you a few days of distance from the situation. Marcus untied his apron with steady hands, movements deliberate and controlled, despite the way his thoughts raced. He folded the black fabric, neatly creasing it along lines worn smooth by years of use, and set it on a nearby table with care that suggested ritual rather than simple tidiness. You're not protecting me, Gerald. You're protecting the restaurant. There's a world of difference between those two things. He walked toward the service elevator without looking back. Gerald's muttered commentary about careers and professional suicide fading behind him like radio static losing signal. Each step felt both heavy and light, simultaneously weighted with consequences, but freed from something he hadn't realized he'd been carrying until it was gone. The elevator arrived with a soft chime that seemed too cheerful for the moment, doors sliding open to reveal his own reflection in the polished metal walls. The man staring back at him looked different somehow, though Marcus couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Same face, same exhaustion, etched in the lines around his eyes, same uniform that marked him as service industry. But something in his posture had shifted, some quality of how he held himself that suggested a transformation occurring beneath the surface. He looked tired in that reflection. He looked scared, and he had every reason to be scared, given what he had just thrown away for the sake of words spoken in anger and righteousness. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fear, he also looked like a man who had remembered something essential about himself, something the world had been trying for 4 years to strip away and almost succeeded. The elevator descended in silence, the numbers on the display ticking backward toward ground level. Marcus watched them change, each floor passed, representing another moment of distance from the confrontation, another second added to the space between action and consequence. By the time the doors opened onto the marble lobby, he had almost convinced himself to feel something other than numb. The night air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside, cold and sharp, with the particular edge that November carried in New York. The temperature had dropped while he was inside autumn, giving way to something that hinted at winter's approach. He pulled his jacket tighter, a thin windbreaker that did almost nothing against the cold, but was all he owned, and started walking. He should have taken the subway directly home. The logical choice, the efficient choice, the choice that would get him back to Brooklyn fastest. But logic felt insufficient for the moment, efficiency meaningless when measured against the chaos churning through his thoughts. Instead, he walked, letting his feet carry him through streets that glittered with wealth and aspiration. Fifth Avenue stretched before him, storefronts displaying goods that cost more than months of his salary. Windows showcased jewelry that would pay his rent for a year, clothing that would cover Lily's education through high school, watches worth more than everything he owned combined. The displays were lit like art installations, transforming commerce into something approaching religion, the worship of objects elevated to spiritual practice. Marcus walked past them all, seeing but not seeing, his mind replaying the confrontation in the private dining room with obsessive attention to detail. Had he chosen the right words? Should he have stayed silent? What would Sarah have said about his decision to speak up, to risk everything for the sake of dignity that couldn't be deposited in a bank or used to pay bills? He remembered her voice, the way she used to challenge him when he got too comfortable with compromise. Sarah had possessed a moral clarity that he sometimes envied and sometimes found exhausting, a refusal to accept easy answers when hard questions demanded more. She would have understood tonight's choice, even if she might have worried about its consequences. She would have seen the impossible position he'd been placed in and recognized that sometimes there were no good options, only choices between different kinds of damage. The thought of her brought fresh pain, the kind that never fully went away, even after 4 years. Grief was supposed to diminish with time. That's what everyone said, what all the well-meaning people at the funeral had promised. Time heals all wounds. The pain will fade. You'll learn to move on. But they were wrong, or at least not entirely right. The pain didn't fade so much as it changed shape, becoming something he carried differently, but carried nonetheless. He found himself in Central Park, somehow having crossed into green space without consciously deciding to enter. The paths were mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional jogger or couple walking hand in hand, people whose lives apparently afforded them the luxury of leisure after dark. Trees stood in bare silhouette against the city lights, branches reaching toward a sky that glowed orange with reflected illumination. Marcus sat on a bench that overlooked the pier and the water's surface, reflecting the buildings that surrounded the park on all sides. The view looked like something from a postcard New York, as people imagined it rather than how most people experienced it. From here, you couldn't see the struggling neighborhoods or the people sleeping in doorways or the thousand small indignities that poverty inflicted daily. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him from thoughts that had grown circular and unproductive. He pulled it out, expecting to see Gerald's name, maybe a message about the formal termination that was surely coming. Instead, the screen showed Miss Patterson's number, and his heart jumped into his throat. Something wrong with Lily. Had to be. Why else would Mrs. Patterson call this early in his shift? His fingers fumbled with the screen, nearly dropping the phone in his haste to answer. "Marcus, everything's fine here, honey. Don't panic." Mrs. Patterson's voice came through scratchy but reassuring speaking before he could spiral completely into worst-case scenarios. "Lily just wanted me to call and say goodnight. She's having trouble sleeping, asking about you." The knot in Marcus's chest loosened slightly, terror converting to a different kind of ache. "Can I talk to her?" A moment of rustling, the sound of the phone being passed. Then Lily's voice came through small and sleepy. "Daddy. Hey, baby girl. You should be asleep by now, I know." Her voice carried that particular quality of a child fighting against tiredness, determined to stay awake despite biology's insistence otherwise. "I just wanted to hear your voice. Mrs. Patterson said you're at work making money so we can keep our apartment." "That's right, sweetheart." Marcus forced brightness into his tone, trying to sound like a man who still had a job, rather than someone who had just thrown away their only source of income. "I'm working hard so we can have a nice home. When you come back, can we practice more Japanese? I want to learn how to write. I miss you." The request hit him harder than it should have, innocent words carrying weight they weren't designed to bear. "Of course we can. First thing in the morning, we'll practice together. Now you need to sleep, okay? Growing girls need their rest." "Okay, Daddy, I love you. I love you too, Lily, more than anything in the whole world." The call ended and Marcus sat on the bench, holding his silent phone, staring at the dark screen, as though it might reveal answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. His daughter wanted to learn how to write "I miss you" in Japanese, a phrase that carried more truth than she probably understood. They were missing each other constantly, passing like ships in the night, his work schedule ensuring they rarely occupied the same waking hours. And now he had endangered even that inadequate arrangement. For what? For pride. For the principle that his dignity mattered more than practical survival. What good was dignity if it meant Lily ended up in foster care or worse? But even as the doubt spiraled through his thoughts, another part of him pushed back with stubborn insistence. What kind of father would he be if he taught Lily that self-respect was negotiable? What kind of man would he become if he let wealthy strangers call him useless and pathetic, and thank them for the privilege? At what point did survival stop being survival and start being just another form of dying? Marcus stood from the bench and resumed walking, aiming himself toward the subway station that would take him home. The park paths led him back to streets' green space, giving way to concrete and glass, the temporary respite from urban intensity ending as abruptly as it had begun. The subway station swallowed him down into its fluorescent depths, platforms mostly empty at this hour between the evening rush and the late-night crowd. He waited for the Brooklyn-bound train with a handful of other travelers, everyone maintaining the careful isolation that public transit demanded. Don't make eye contact. Don't acknowledge the shared space. Exist in your own bubble and pretend everyone else doesn't exist. The train, when it arrived, was nearly empty, offering Marcus his pick of seats. He chose one near the door and watched the darkness beyond the windows, seeing nothing but his own reflection in the glass. The face looking back at him still showed that strange transformation he couldn't quite name, some shift in bearing that suggested internal change manifesting in external ways. The ride to Brooklyn took 40 minutes, the train making its stops with mechanical regularity, passengers boarding and departing in the eternal circulation of a city that never fully slept. Marcus barely noticed them, his attention turned inward, running calculations that grew more depressing with each iteration. Suspended meant no income. No income meant the bills on his kitchen table would remain unpaid. Unpaid bills meant consequences cascading like dominoes, each one triggering the next in a chain reaction he couldn't stop. Eviction proceedings typically took 30 days from final notice, which meant he had perhaps 3 weeks before they were forced out. The electric company would shut off power in 72 hours if he didn't pay, which he couldn't, which meant they'd be sitting in darkness come the weekend. And Lily's preschool wouldn't let her return without payment, which meant finding childcare or leaving her with Mrs. Patterson more than he already did, which meant taking advantage of an elderly woman's kindness beyond what was reasonable or fair. The math didn't work. No matter how he arranged the numbers, they refused to add up to anything resembling stability. Had been falling for 4 years, but had convinced himself that the controlled descent was actually standing still. Tonight's confrontation had stripped away that comfortable delusion, revealing just how far down he had actually gone. The train reached his stop and disgorged him onto a platform that smelled of brake dust and old urine. "Welcome back to Berwyn," written in every detail. He climbed the stairs to street level and walked the 3 blocks to his building, passing familiar landmarks that marked the boundaries of his reduced world. The bodega on the corner was still open, its security bars glowing with fluorescent light. The laundromat was closed now, dark windows reflecting the streetlights. The small park where homeless people slept had acquired a few new occupants since mourning bundles of humanity wrapped in insufficient blankets against the November cold. His building rose before him, 7 stories of weathered brick and peeling paint home to people who couldn't afford better and weren't quite desperate enough for worse. The front door stuck the way it always stuck, requiring a specific combination of turning and pulling and shouldering that residents learned through repetition. Marcus performed the sequence automatically and stepped into a lobby that smelled of mildew and industrial cleaner. The elevator wasn't worth attempting this late at night, its reliability dropping significantly after 9 p.m. He took the stairs again, climbing 7 flights with legs that burned from standing all evening and feet that ached from shoes designed for appearance rather than comfort. By the time he reached his floor, his breathing came harder than it should have, exhaustion finally catching up to override the adrenaline that had been sustaining him. His apartment door stood exactly as he'd left it that morning. Nothing changed, but everything different because he was different. The key turned in the lock with its familiar catch, and he stepped inside to find the living room dim, except for the television's glow. Mrs. Patterson had fallen asleep on the couch, her knitting needles still clutched in weathered hands, yarn pooling in her lap like colorful rivers. The television played some late-night program with the sound turned low, moving images providing light without much meaning. She looked small and fragile in sleep, this elderly woman who watched his daughter for less than she deserved because kindness sometimes mattered more than market rates. Marcus moved quietly to wake her, touching her shoulder with gentle pressure. She startled awake with the quick alertness of people who had learned not to sleep too deeply, eyes opening and focusing on his face with immediate clarity. "Oh, honey, you're home early." Her voice carried concern beneath the words. Observation converting instantly to worry. "Is everything all right?" He helped her gather her knitting, avoiding the question because answering it would require explanations he didn't have energy for. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for staying with Lily." She studied his face with those sharp eyes that age hadn't dimmed, reading truth in whatever she saw there. Her mouth opened as though to press the issue, then closed again as she decided against it. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand with fingers that felt like paper and bone, a gesture that conveyed understanding without requiring words. "That child loves you something fierce. Don't you forget that when things get hard." Marcus walked her to the door, pressing $20 into her hand despite her protests. She took it, finally tucking the bills into her purse with the resignation of someone who understood that pride sometimes had to yield to practical necessity. He watched her shuffle down the hallway to her own apartment, 2 doors down, waited until he heard her door close and lock, then turned back to his own space. The apartment felt smaller than usual, walls pressing closer in the dim light. He moved through it quietly, checking that doors were locked and lights were off, performing the small rituals of nighttime preparation. In the kitchen, the stack of bills waited on the table exactly where he'd left them, envelopes radiating accusation. Marcus sat down and spread them out, forcing himself to confront the numbers with clear eyes. The math hadn't improved during his absence. If anything, it had gotten worse, the day's passage adding interest and penalties to amounts he already couldn't pay. Rent $800 plus $50 late fee equals $850. Electric $147, final notice. Preschool $350, payment required for continued enrollment. Total $1,347. Available funds $42 remaining after paying Mrs. Patterson. The gap between those numbers represented more than money. It represented the distance between keeping and losing, between stability and chaos, between having a home and not having a home. And he had just closed off his only path across that gap by choosing pride over pragmatism in a private dining room overlooking Central Park. Marcus lowered his head into his hands, elbows propped on the cheap table that wobbled under the pressure. Exhaustion crashed over him in waves, not just physical tiredness from standing all evening, but something deeper, a bone-deep weariness accumulated over 4 years of constant struggle against odds that seemed determined to grind him down. He had tried so hard, had swallowed so much, had accepted so many indignities with the kind of grace that came from having no other choice. He had transformed himself from Columbia University linguistics student to high-end restaurant server, had buried his dreams beneath the more immediate needs of feeding and housing a small child. He had become someone he barely recognized, had worn the mask of submission so long it had started to feel like his actual face. And for what? To reach this moment, sitting in a dim kitchen, surrounded by bills he couldn't pay, suspended from a job he hated but desperately needed, contemplating a future that looked increasingly like disaster. But even as the despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, even as his rational mind cataloged all the reasons why tonight's choice had been catastrophically stupid, some small voice inside of him refused to regret what he'd done. He had stood up for himself, had refused to be diminished, had claimed his dignity in a moment when doing so carried the highest possible cost. He thought about Lily asking to learn "I miss you" in Japanese, thought about her drawing with its stick figures and wobbly characters, thought about the lessons each morning where he tried to give her something the world couldn't take away. What would he tell her someday when she asked what he did when someone tried to strip away his humanity? Could he look her in the eye and say he had apologized for existing? The answer rose from somewhere deep inside him, clear and unwavering, despite the chaos surrounding it. No, he couldn't have done that. Couldn't have let his daughter grow up watching her father accept abuse as the price of survival. Better to fall with dignity than to stand on knees ground down to bone and blood. Marcus lifted his head from his hands and looked around the small apartment that might not be his much longer. Everything here told the story of their reduced circumstances. The sagging second-hand couch, the wobbly kitchen table, the appliances that worked but barely. But it was clean, it was maintained, it was a home he had built for his daughter from whatever materials poverty left available. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the value of tonight's choice wouldn't be measured in dollars kept or lost, but in something harder to quantify. Maybe Lily would remember not the times they struggled, but the fact that her father had never let the struggle define his worth. Or maybe he was just rationalizing catastrophic failure, wrapping disaster in noble language to make it easier to swallow. He didn't know, couldn't know, could only move forward one day at a time and hope that the path eventually led somewhere that resembled okay. Marcus stood from the table and moved toward Lily's room, drawn by the need to see her sleeping face to remind himself what all this struggle was actually for. He opened her door carefully, letting it swing inward without creaking, and stood in the doorway looking at his daughter. She lay curled on her side beneath the purple comforter they had found at a thrift store, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant that had been Sarah's last gift to her. In her other hand, she still clutched the drawing, the paper crumpled now from being held so tight, the stick figures and Japanese characters still visible despite the damage. Papa Daisuke, I love Daddy. Marcus knelt beside her bed and watched her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her small chest, finding something approaching peace in the simple rhythm of her life continuing. In sleep, her face relaxed completely, the worries and questions of a 6-year-old temporarily suspended, leaving only the essential innocence of childhood. She looked so much like Sarah in these moments, the similarity strong enough to make his chest ache with a grief that never completely healed. The shape of her face, the curve of her cheekbones, the way her hair fell across the pillow. All Sarah's features recreated in miniature, a living reminder of everything he had lost and everything he still had to protect. I'm sorry, baby girl. The words came out barely louder than breathing confession offered to someone who couldn't hear it. I don't know what happens next. Don't know if I made the right choice tonight or if it just destroyed everything we've worked so hard to build. But I promise you this much, whatever comes, we'll face it together. I won't let you down. Not if there's anything I can do to prevent it. Lily stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't wake her fingers tightening around the drawing as though it were a lifeline connecting her to something important. Marcus pulled her blanket up higher, tucking it around her shoulders with care, brushed a kiss across her forehead, that probably meant more to him than to her, and left the room as quietly as he had entered. Back in the hallway, he leaned against the wall and let his eyes close, exhaustion finally overwhelming his ability to resist it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight had already extracted everything he had to give. His body ached from standing. His mind spun with scenarios and calculations and fears that refused to coalesce into anything useful. His heart carried weight that had nothing to do with physical load and everything to do with the burden of responsibility for another human being who depended on him completely. But underneath all of that, buried beneath the exhaustion and fear and overwhelming uncertainty, lived something that felt almost like peace. He had stood up, had refused to be diminished, had chosen dignity over submission, even knowing the cost. And whatever came next, at least he could face it knowing he hadn't sacrificed the part of himself that mattered most. Marcus pushed himself away from the wall and moved toward his own room, the small space he had carved out in a corner of the apartment after giving Lily the actual bedroom. Just a mattress on the floor and a lamp and the few possessions he had managed to keep from his previous life. Books, mostly language textbooks and literature, he no longer had time to read but couldn't bring himself to abandon. He lay down without bothering to change clothes, still wearing the white shirt and black pants that constituted his server's uniform. The ceiling above him showed cracks that landlords promised to fix but never did, patterns he had memorized through countless nights of staring upward, unable to sleep. Tomorrow he would need to start figuring out what came next. Job hunting probably, though, at his employment prospects had just taken a severe hit. Maybe explaining the situation to his landlord and begging for an extension on rent, though landlords in Brooklyn rarely responded to begging with anything resembling mercy. Possibly looking into assistance programs, swallowing whatever remained of his pride to ask for help from systems designed to make help as difficult as possible to access. But all of that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he just needed to sleep, to let his body and mind shut down for a few hours before facing whatever fresh disasters daylight would bring. His eyes drifted closed despite his mind's continued racing exhaustion, finally winning the battle it had been fighting since 4:30 that morning. The last thing Marcus thought before sleep took him was Lily's drawing those wobbly hiragana characters spelling out her love. And beneath that thought, running like a quiet current through everything else, was the memory of looking Reina Takahashi in the eye and refusing to apologize for who he was. Whatever that choice cost him, whatever consequences it brought, crashing down, at least he could say he had faced them with his dignity intact. And maybe, just maybe, that would turn out to be worth more than all the money he would never have. Somewhere in Manhattan, in a penthouse apartment that commanded views in every direction, Reina Takahashi stood at floor-to-ceiling windows and discovered that she could not sleep. The knock at the door came at 8 in the morning, jarring Marcus from a sleep that had been more unconsciousness than rest. He jerked upright on his mattress, disoriented for a moment about where he was and what day it was, his mind still tangled in dreams that mixed confrontation with catastrophe. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, painting stripes across the floor. Morning already, though his body felt like he had barely closed his eyes. The knock came again, more insistent, this time the sound cutting through the apartment's morning quiet. Marcus pulled himself to his feet, his muscles protesting with aches that spoke to how poorly he had slept. He was still wearing yesterday's work clothes, the white shirt wrinkled and the black pants creased from sleeping in them. He moved toward the door, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt at making himself presentable. Through the peephole, he saw a young woman in a crisp gray suit, everything about her projecting an air of absolute certainty. She stood with perfect posture, holding what appeared to be an envelope, her expression neutral in that way that professional people cultivated when delivering messages they weren't paid to have opinions about. Marcus opened the door with the chain still attached, caution overriding curiosity. The woman didn't seem surprised by this precaution, simply waited with patient silence for him to make whatever assessment he needed to make. "Yes, Mr. Hall, Mr. Marcus Hall, that's me." She extended her hand through the maid, offering a cream-colored envelope and a business card made of paper so thick and expensive it felt more like fabric than cardstock. Her movements were efficient, practiced the gestures of someone who delivered things to people for a living. "Miss Takahashi requests your presence at Takahashi Industries headquarters this morning, 10 o'clock. A car will be waiting downstairs at 9:30 should you choose to accept the invitation." Before Marcus could formulate a response, before he could ask any of the dozen questions forming in his mind, she turned and walked away. Her heels clicked a precise rhythm against the hallway floor, the sound fading as she rounded the corner and disappeared from view. Marcus closed the door slowly and examined what she had left him. The business card was simple, just a name and address in elegant typography. Catherine Chen, Executive Assistant to CEO. The address was on Fifth Avenue, numbers that placed it in the kind of neighborhood where Marcus's entire monthly salary wouldn't cover a week's rent. The envelope bore his name written in elegant script, the kind of handwriting that suggested expensive education and years of practice. He turned it over, found no other markings, and carefully opened it. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, matching the envelope with one handwritten line. "This is not revenge. This is a conversation." Marcus read those 7 words 3 times, trying to decode their meaning through the fog of too little sleep and too much stress. His mind cycled through possibilities, each one seeming as plausible as the next. A trap designed to humiliate him, further payback for his defiance, delivered with corporate politeness. A legal threat wrapped in civilized language, lawsuit papers waiting in some lawyer's office. Some elaborate power play meant to remind him exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of people who mattered. But something about the handwriting gave him pause. The letters were careful, almost hesitant, lacking the bold confidence he would have expected from someone like Reina Takahashi. There was vulnerability in those pen strokes, if you look closely enough, uncertainty hiding beneath the formal presentation. "Daddy." He turned to find Lily standing in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes with both fists. She wore her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon animals that were getting too small but that she refused to abandon. Her hair stood in wild directions, and her face carried the particular softness that children had when they first woke up. "You're still here." Her voice mixed surprise with pleasure, the unexpected gift of finding him home when normally he would have already left for work or not yet returned from his shift. "You didn't go to work last night." The lie formed automatically protective instinct, wanting to shield her from worry. But Marcus caught himself before the words emerged, remembering that children sense deception, even when they couldn't name it. That trust eroded faster than it could be rebuilt. "I had to come home early. Something happened at work. Are you in trouble?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, her 6-year-old intuition cutting through to the heart of things adults spent paragraphs dancing around. He knelt down to her level, needing to see her face when he answered. "Maybe a little trouble, but nothing for you to worry about. Okay, Daddy will figure it out." Lily studied him with those eyes that were too knowing for someone so young. Sarah's eyes in miniature form, seeing more than he sometimes wanted to be seen. Then she threw her arms around his neck in a hug that nearly knocked him backward. "I don't want you to be in trouble." Marcus held her tight, breathing in the strawberry shampoo smell of her hair, feeling the solid weight of her small body against his chest. This was what mattered, not me's or bills, or the opinions of wealthy people who treated service workers like animate objects. This child who loved him unconditionally, who trusted him to protect her from a world that didn't care about people without money or power. "Tell you what, how about we have a special breakfast together? Pancakes." Her face lit up with the kind of joy that simple pleasures brought to children. Uncomplicated happiness at the prospect of pancakes and time together. "Really, with the chocolate chips, with chocolate chips. But then, I need you to play in your room for a little while because Daddy has to go somewhere this morning. We're just a meeting. I'll tell you all about it later." They moved to the kitchen together, Lily climbing onto her chair, while Marcus gathered ingredients. The apartment felt different in morning light, less oppressive than it did at night, when exhaustion amplified every flaw. Sunlight through the windows made even the peeling paint and worn furniture seem almost charming, poverty temporarily disguised as rustic simplicity. He mixed pancake batter, while Lily watched her legs swinging beneath the chair, humming some song she had learned at school. The domesticity of the moment felt both ordinary and precious, the kind of memory that would matter more in retrospect than it seemed to in the present. The pancakes cooked on their cheap griddle, chocolate chips melting into the batter exactly the way Lily liked them. Marcus plated them with ceremony, adding a dollop of syrup and presenting the meal like it was something special, rather than just breakfast on a weekday morning. They ate together, Lily chattering about school and her friends and the book they were reading in class. Marcus listened with half his attention, the other half circling back to the invitation on the counter, trying to decide what responding to it would mean. Going to meet Reina Takahashi felt dangerous in ways he couldn't fully articulate. She had power and influence resources she could deploy to make his life considerably worse if she chose to. Walking into her territory, her building her office meant surrendering whatever small advantage anonymity provided. But not going meant living with uncertainty, waiting for consequences to arrive rather than facing them directly. And something about that handwritten line kept pulling at him. This is not revenge. This is a conversation. What did someone like Reina Takahashi want to have a conversation about with someone like him? What possible common ground could exist between a tech billionaire and a suspended waiter whose greatest asset was knowledge he couldn't monetize? After breakfast, Lily went to her room to play, while Marcus showered and dressed in the only clothes he owned that approximated professional. A button-down shirt that was clean but not crisp, pants that fit but showed their age around the knees. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone trying to present dignity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. Mrs. Patterson agreed to watch Lily for a few hours, appearing at his door with her knitting bag and questions she was kind enough not to ask aloud. Her eyes traveled over his outfit and read the situation clearly enough that words became unnecessary. You look like you're going somewhere important. Maybe. I'm not sure yet. Will you be careful, honey? Important places don't always mean safe places. The wisdom in her words settled over him like a weight. He kissed Lily goodbye, promising to be back soon, and headed downstairs to where a black town car waited at the curb. The driver opened the rear door without speaking, and Marcus slid onto leather seats that probably cost more than everything he owned combined. The car's interior smelled of expensive cologne and possibility the scent of a world he didn't belong to but was temporarily being allowed to visit. They pulled away from his building, leaving behind the familiar landscape of his reduced life. Marcus watched Brooklyn transform through tinted windows, crumbling walk-ups, giving way to renovated brownstones, struggling bodegas replaced by artisanal coffee shops. Gentrification creating pockets of wealth in neighborhoods that used to be affordable, pushing people like him further to the margins. The drive across the bridge into Manhattan felt like crossing between dimensions. The city changed character completely. Buildings growing taller, streets cleaner, everything polished and maintained in ways that required money most people would never possess. This was the New York that appeared in movies and magazines, the version tourists saw and fell in love with, carefully curated to hide all the messy reality lurking in outer boroughs. Takahashi Industries occupied a glass tower that seemed to pierce the sky with architectural arrogance. The building's surface reflected clouds and sunlight, turning weather into decoration, transforming the natural world into something that existed only to make human achievement look more impressive. The lobby was larger than Marcus's entire apartment building, all marble floors and soaring ceilings, in the hushed atmosphere of a space where ordinary concerns didn't apply. Security guards nodded as he approached, clearly expecting him, his name already on some list that granted access to spaces normally off-limits. 50th floor, Ms. Takahashi is waiting. The elevator rose in perfect silence, numbers climbing on the display with digital precision. Marcus felt his stomach drop as they ascended, whether from the speed of the elevator or anxiety about what waited above, he couldn't determine. The doors opened onto a floor that looked like wealth had been liquefied and poured into architectural form. Polished marble floor-to-ceiling windows, art on walls that probably cost more than most people's houses. Everything designed to communicate that the people who worked here operated on a different plane than ordinary humanity. Catherine materialized at his elbow, the same woman who had delivered the invitation that morning. She guided him through a maze of glass-walled offices toward a corner suite that commanded views in every direction, the city spread out below like a kingdom waiting to be ruled. Reina Takahashi sat behind a desk made of dark wood and polished chrome, but in morning light she looked different from the woman who had insulted him last night. Smaller somehow, less armored. She wore a simple gray blouse instead of the severe black suit, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders rather than being pulled back with painful precision. She stood when he entered, and something in her posture suggested uncertainty, an emotion Marcus would never have associated with her based on their previous encounter. "Mr. Hall, thank you for coming." Her voice carried none of last night's contempt, stripped of the cruel superiority that had dripped from every syllable when she spoke Japanese in that private dining room. She sounded almost tentative, as though she wasn't certain what to say or how to say it. Marcus remained near the doorway, maintaining distance, unwilling to move further into the space until he understood what he was walking into. Your note said this isn't revenge. I'm here to find out what it actually is. Raina gestured toward a chair positioned across from her desk, but Marcus made no move to sit. She nodded slowly as though she had expected exactly that response, as though his refusal to be immediately comfortable somehow satisfied her. I owe you an apology. The words seemed to cost her something emerging with visible effort. What I said to you last night was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and your boa, and every single one of those assumptions was wrong. Yes, they were. I've spent the last 12 hours examining why I said those things, trying to understand what made me capable of such cruelty. She moved toward the windows, turning her back to him as she gazed out at the city below. And I realized something deeply uncomfortable about myself. Marcus waited, saying nothing, letting silence do the work of pressure. She had invited him here, had requested this conversation. Whatever needed to be said was hers to say. 20 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. Her voice dropped lower, confession replacing explanation. Different circumstances, different country, but fundamentally the same situation. I worked in a restaurant in Osaka, serving wealthy men who treated me like I was worth less than the furniture. She turned to face him, and Marcus saw something raw and unguarded in her expression that hadn't been visible last night. One of them knocked over his drink and blamed me for it, called me useless, pathetic, said I was only fit for manual labor. All the same things I said to you almost word for word. The parallel hadn't occurred to me until you spoke back, until you reminded me what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of contempt. Marcus studied her face carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or performance. He found neither, just the uncomfortable honesty of someone confronting ugly truths about themselves for the first time. I swore that night I would become so powerful that no one would ever dare speak to me that way again. Raina's hands clasped together in front of her fingers, intertwining with tension that belied her measured words. And I succeeded beyond what I could have imagined. But somewhere along the way, I became the person I swore to destroy. I became him, the man who looked at me and saw nothing worth respecting. What exactly do you want from me? Marcus's voice came out harder than he intended, suspicion overriding the sympathy her story might have evoked under different circumstances. I want to offer you a job. The words hung suspended in the air between them, completely unexpected, despite the elaborate setup that had brought him to this office. Marcus had prepared himself for apologies or threats, for legal maneuvering or corporate intimidation. But this possibility hadn't occurred to him. Raina returned to her desk and picked up a folder thick with documents. I did research this morning. Columbia University linguistics major, top of your class before circumstances forced you to leave. Fluent in 4 languages, English, Japanese, French, Spanish. You possess exactly the combination of skills my company desperately needs. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning pages before looking up to meet his gaze. International Translation and Coordination Director. You would serve as the primary bridge between our offices in Tokyo, Paris, and New York, facilitating communication across languages and cultures. The salary is $120,000 annually plus comprehensive benefits. Full health insurance for you and your daughter. Marcus felt the number land like a physical blow, the amount so far beyond what he currently earned that it barely registered as real. $120,000. 5 times his Lumiere salary, enough to pay every bill on his kitchen table and never worry about them again. The schedule would be flexible. You could take your daughter to school every morning and have dinner with her every evening. Regular hours, weekends, off, the kind of life that lets you actually be present for the child you're working to support. It was everything he needed, everything he had sacrificed 4 years of dignity and exhaustion trying to achieve. Being offered to him by the woman who had humiliated him less than 24 hours ago, presented like compensation or bribery, or perhaps both simultaneously. Why? Marcus asked, genuine confusion cutting through his caution. You could find dozens of qualified candidates, people with completed degrees, people who didn't embarrass you in front of your business partners last night, because I don't need someone who will tell me what I want to hear. Raina closed the folder and set it aside. I have an entire company full of those people already. What I need is someone who will tell me the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. She leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. You did something last night that no one has done in years. You held up a mirror and forced me to see what I had become. I didn't like what I saw, but that's precisely why I need someone like you. Someone who won't let me forget where I came from or what it feels like to be powerless. Marcus crossed the room finally and sat down in the offered chair, his mind racing through implications and calculating risks. If I were to consider this offer, he said carefully, I would have conditions. Name them. He raised one finger. First, you will never insult or discriminate against me or any employee because of their race, background, or circumstances. Not publicly, not privately, not in any language you assume they don't understand. If I ever witness you speaking to anyone the way you spoke to me last night, I walk away immediately. No second chances, no negotiations. Raina nodded without hesitation. Agreed. Second, Marcus raised another finger. My daughter is my absolute priority. I need to leave the office at 3 to pick her up from school and have dinner with her every evening. My schedule must accommodate that requirement without exception. That can easily be arranged. Third, Marcus lowered his hand, his voice taking on an edge of challenge. I want you to establish a scholarship fund for children from underprivileged backgrounds who demonstrate talent for languages. Kids like I was intelligent and capable, but without financial resources. I want your company to give them the opportunities that circumstance denied them. Raina's expression shifted uncertainty, replacing her previous confidence. For the first time since he entered her office, she looked genuinely unsure. A scholarship fund of that nature would require significant resources and board approval. I can't promise something like that unilaterally. Then we don't have a deal. Marcus stood preparing to leave. He had anticipated this moment during the car ride, had made peace with the possibility that his principles would cost him this opportunity. Some things were worth more than money, even when money represented the difference between stability and disaster. Mr. Hall, please wait. He stopped but didn't turn around, forcing her to speak to his back the way she had forced him to absorb her insults. I cannot promise the board will approve it immediately. Raina's voice carried genuine appeal rather than manipulation. These things require time, politics, building consensus. It could take 6 months or longer. Marcus turned to face her, finally waiting for whatever compromise she was building toward. But I can promise you this. She came around her desk, meeting him in the open space between furniture. I will personally advocate for that fund in every board meeting. I will fight for it until it becomes reality, no matter how long it takes or how much resistance I encounter. You have my word, your word. Marcus let the phrase hang between them, weighted with history. Last night your word was used to humiliate me. I know. For the first time, something resembling shame crossed Raina's features. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove I can be better than that. Not because I deserve the chance. I know I don't. But because you gave me something last night that I had forgotten I ever possessed. You reminded me of the girl I used to be before success corrupted her. Marcus studied her face, looking for deception and finding only vulnerability. He thought about Lily waiting at home with Mrs. Patterson, about the bills that wouldn't pay themselves, about 4 years of swallowing dignity, one insult at a time. And he thought about what Sarah would have said, her voice echoing across time with that moral clarity he still relied on. She would have asked whether second chances were possible, whether people could change, whether redemption was something available only to those who never needed it. I'll try. The words came out quietly but firmly. But understand this clearly. The moment you break your word, the moment you treat me or anyone else with the contempt you showed last night, I'm gone. No discussion, no negotiation, just gone. Raina extended her hand and Marcus saw that it trembled slightly. Fair enough. They shook her grip firm, despite the tremor, her eyes steady, despite whatever uncertainty lived beneath the surface. When can you start? Monday? I'm going to spend this weekend with my daughter. Raina nodded and something that might have been respect flickered across her face. Monday then. Welcome to Takahashi Industries, Marcus. He left her office and rode the elevator down in silence, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. 24 hours ago, he had been suspended from his job for defending his dignity. Now he had a position that would transform his life and his daughter's life, offered by the person whose cruelty had catalyzed the entire sequence of events. The car waited outside to take him back to Brooklyn, but Marcus waved it off and chose to walk instead. He needed time to think, needed the physical movement to help his mind catch up to what had just happened. He walked through Manhattan streets, barely seeing them, his thoughts churning. Had he made the right choice accepting the offer? Could he trust Reina to keep her word? What would happen when the board inevitably pushed back on the scholarship fund? But underneath those questions ran something that felt almost like hope, fragile and tentative, but present nonetheless. Maybe people could change. Maybe wealth didn't have to corrupt completely. Maybe second chances were possible, even for those who seemed least deserving of them. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Patterson to let her know he'd be home soon. Then he started walking faster, suddenly desperate to see Lily, to hold her and tell her that maybe, just maybe, things were going to get better. The city streamed past him, millions of people pursuing their own versions of survival and meaning. And somewhere in that vast complexity, Marcus Hall walked home carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything, hoping he had chosen wisely. 3 years passed like water flowing around the stones, reshaping everything it touched while appearing to move effortlessly forward. Marcus Hall stood in the conference room on the 50th floor, watching screens display faces from 3 different continents, and felt the peculiar satisfaction of having become someone he barely recognized from his previous life. Tokyo glowed with early morning light behind the faces of engineers and project managers who spoke rapid Japanese about development timelines and resource allocation. Paris sparkled with afternoon sun filtering through windows, where designers debated aesthetic choices in French that flowed like music. New York hummed with mid-morning energy as the local team presented quarterly projections in English clipped by the urgency of American business culture. Marcus moved between languages like water flowing between stones, his mind switching grammatical structures and cultural contexts with an ease that 3 years of practice had transformed from effort into instinct. He translated not just words but intent bridging gaps that existed beneath vocabulary, ensuring that what Tokyo understood matched what Paris meant and what New York needed. Yamamoto-san raises an important point about the user interface. His Japanese carried the formal register appropriate for addressing senior engineers across hierarchical distance. He suggests the current design prioritizes aesthetics over functionality in ways that could frustrate Japanese users specifically. He switched to French without pause, his accent carrying the precision of classroom learning, polished by constant use. L'équipe de Paris peut répondre à ces préoccupations tout en maintenant l'intégrité visuelle que vous avez établie. The Parisian lead designer responded with enthusiasm, her rapid French explaining how minor adjustments could satisfy both requirements. Marcus absorbed her explanation, translated the technical details into Japanese for Tokyo's benefit, then synthesized the entire exchange into English for the New York executives who needed to understand budget implications. This was what he did now. This was who he had become. Not a man carrying serving trays and swallowing insults, but someone whose expertise shaped decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers across continents. The transformation still startled him some mornings when he woke in his new apartment in a better neighborhood, with windows that actually closed properly. The conference lasted 90 minutes, concluding with agreements on next steps and timelines that would be documented in 3 languages for distribution across global offices. Marcus closed his laptop and glanced at the clock. 2:15. Plenty of time to finish notes and leave by 3. The ritual of 3 o'clock departures had become sacred, protected by the agreement he had made with Reina 3 years ago. Every single day, regardless of meetings or deadlines or crises that other executives treated as emergencies, Marcus left the office at 3 to pick up Lily from school. Some colleagues had initially viewed this as special treatment or lack of commitment, but Reina had made it clear from his first week that challenging Marcus's schedule meant challenging her directly. He gathered his materials and headed toward his own office, a smaller space than Reina's, but still commanding impressive views and furnished with the kind of quality that communicated respect. His desk held framed photos of Lily at various ages, her face maturing from 6 to 9, her expressions growing more confident as their lives stabilized. The newest photo showed her from last week standing in their kitchen, holding a sign in Japanese characters, announcing her achievement of conversational fluency. Her smile radiated pride and her eyes held that particular sparkle that children got when they accomplished something they had worked hard to achieve. Marcus. Reina's voice came from his doorway, and he turned to find her leaning against the frame with an expression he had learned to recognize as complicated news delivered with careful diplomacy. Good meeting with the international teams. Your ability to navigate those cultural nuances continues to impress me. Thank you. But that's not why you're here. She smiled slightly, acknowledging his ability to read her after 3 years of working together. No, I wanted to give you an update on the scholarship fund. The board met yesterday. Marcus felt his chest tighten despite 3 years of learning to manage expectations around this particular topic. The scholarship fund had become the measure by which he judged whether Raina's transformation was genuine or merely performed for his benefit. And the board's resistance had tested both her commitment and his patience repeatedly. We finally have approval. Her words came quickly, relief evident beneath professional composure. Full funding, comprehensive criteria, everything we proposed. The Marcus Hall Scholarship Foundation will accept its first applicants next month. The name landed like something physical, syllables carrying weight beyond their sound. He had known she intended to name it after him, but hearing it spoken aloud transformed abstract concept into concrete reality. The board meeting was contentious, I won't lie to you. Raina moved into his office and sat in the chair across from his desk without invitation, exhaustion showing in the gesture. 7 meetings over 11 months, Marcus. 7 times I had to argue that investing in underprivileged children's language education served our long-term interests. 7 times executives who earn more in bonuses than most people see in lifetimes question whether we should spend money on kids who might never work for us. But you convinced them. I reminded them that I was one of those kids once, that you were one of those kids, that intelligence and capability exist independent of bank accounts, and that companies that recognize that fact gain access to talent their competitors overlook. She leaned back, a smile crossing her face that held genuine satisfaction. And I may have mentioned that I would personally fund it if they refused, which would make them look remarkably short-sighted when the foundation succeeded. Marcus felt something release in his chest, tension he had been carrying for 3 years, finally finding permission to dissipate. This had been his condition, the requirement he had staked everything on when accepting Raina's offer. And she had fought for it, had spent 11 months navigating corporate politics and overcoming resistance from people who saw charity as weakness. Thank you. The words felt insufficient for what this meant, but he didn't have better ones available. Thank me by helping select the first recipients. We're planning a ceremony for next month, 30 scholarships awarded to begin with. I'd like you to be part of the selection committee. He nodded, already thinking about criteria and evaluation methods, about how to identify children who possess potential that poverty tried to bury. This was what the struggle had been for. Not just his own advancement, but creating pathways for others who faced the same obstacles he had faced. Now get out of here. It's almost 3. Raina stood and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at him. Lily's probably waiting. Marcus grabbed his coat and laptop bag, the same ritual he performed every weekday at this exact time. The elevator took him down to the lobby. He stepped out onto 5th Avenue into afternoon sunlight that painted Manhattan in shades of gold and shadow. The walk to Lily's school took 15 minutes, a journey he had made so many times he could navigate it without conscious attention. Past the park, where joggers circled with determined expressions. Past the coffee shop, where people paid $7 for drinks that probably cost 40 cents to make. Past the bookstore, where he sometimes stopped to buy Lily new reading material in whatever language she was currently focused on. The school occupied a renovated brownstone, the kind of private institution he never could have afforded on his Lumiere salary. Now Lily attended classes with children of diplomats and executives, received instruction from teachers who held advanced degrees, participated in programs that cultivated, rather than merely accommodated, her gift for languages. She emerged through the front doors in a cluster of other students, her backpack bouncing as she spotted him and accelerated into a run. 9 years old now, legs longer and face losing the roundness of early childhood, becoming someone who looked less like a little kid and more like the young person she would become. Daddy, she crashed into him with the full force of her momentum, arms wrapping around his waist. Guess what happened today? Tell me while we walk. He took her backpack, slinging it over his shoulder alongside his laptop bag, and they started toward their apartment. Madame Laurent said my French pronunciation is getting really good, like native speaker, good. And she asked if I wanted to help tutor the younger students who are just starting. That's wonderful, baby girl. Are you going to do it? I think so. It would be like when you teach me, except I'd be the teacher. Her face glowed with enthusiasm, animated by the prospect of sharing knowledge the way he had shared it with her. They walked together through Manhattan streets that had become familiar terrain, Lily chattering about her classes and friends, and the book she was reading for literature class. Marcus listened with the attention he had promised himself. He would always give her present in these moments, rather than distracted by work or worry or the thousand other concerns that could pull a parent's focus away. Their apartment occupied the third floor of a building that actually had working elevators and heat that functioned reliably. Two bedrooms, a real kitchen, windows that didn't leak cold air. Not luxurious by Manhattan standards, but palatial compared to the Brooklyn place where Marcus had once stared at bills he couldn't pay. Lily went straight to her room to change out of her school uniform while Marcus started preparing dinner, another ritual they had established over 3 years of actually having evenings together. Cooking had become something he enjoyed, time spent creating meals that they would share at a table that didn't wobble. They ate together while Lily continued her update on daily events, her conversation flowing between English, Japanese, and occasional French phrases that she seemed to use without noticing the switches. Marcus corrected her gently when grammatical errors appeared, praised her when she used particularly sophisticated structures, watched her grow into someone who navigated multiple linguistic worlds with the ease of a child who had never known any other way. After dinner, they practiced Japanese together, continuing a ritual that had survived despite no longer being necessary for Marcus's professional development. Lily worked through increasingly complex text, her reading ability now surpassing what he had been capable of at twice her age. She had her mother's gift, that intuitive grasp of language that transcended mere study. The evening passed in comfortable routine, homework and reading, and eventually bedtime negotiations that ended with Lily accepting lights out in exchange for extended reading time tomorrow. Marcus tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and turned out the light, leaving her door open the way she preferred. He sat in the living room afterward with a glass of wine, expensive French vintage he could now afford, and reflected on how dramatically 3 years had transformed their circumstances. They weren't wealthy by New York standards, but they were secure in ways that used to seem impossible. Bills arrived and got paid. The refrigerator stayed full. Lily attended a good school and wore clothes that fit properly and had books whenever she wanted them. But what mattered most wasn't the material improvements, significant as those were. What mattered was time. The ability to be present for his daughter, to share meals and help with homework and hear about her day. To be a father in more than just name, more than just someone who worked constantly to keep them minimally housed and fed. The scholarship fund announcement came 3 weeks later, press release distributed to media outlets, with Raina's characteristic attention to strategic communication. The Marcus Hall Scholarship Foundation, dedicated to providing educational opportunities in language study for talented students from underprivileged backgrounds. Initial funding of $2 million, 30 scholarships awarded annually, comprehensive support, including tutoring and materials. Marcus read the announcement on his laptop and felt emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly satisfaction that his condition had manifested into reality. But also something deeper, a sense that perhaps the confrontation in that private dining room had led to something meaningful beyond his personal advancement. The selection process consumed 2 weeks applications reviewed by committee members who evaluated not just test scores but circumstances, potential, the particular combination of ability and disadvantage that defined their target population. Marcus read through dozens of files, each one telling a story he recognized viscerally because it mirrored his own. 16-year-old from the Bronx, native Spanish speaker, teaching herself Japanese through library books and YouTube videos. 14-year-old from Queens, refugee family from Somalia, fluent in 4 languages by necessity and curious about more. 12-year-old from Brooklyn, father working 2 jobs, mother cleaning offices at night, daughter spending every spare moment studying French because she dreamed of seeing Paris someday. Stories that could have been his story. Children who possessed intelligence and dedication but lacked resources, who studied despite rather than because of their circumstances, who needed someone to invest in their potential the way universities had once been willing to invest in his. The committee selected 30 recipients from over 300 applicants, each decision requiring difficult choices between deserving candidates. But finally, the list was complete, names and faces and stories that would receive this opportunity. The ceremony took place in a ballroom. Raina had personally selected a space grand enough to honor the magnitude of what they were creating. Marcus arrived early and watched the room fill with families who looked slightly overwhelmed by the elegance surrounding them. Parents in their best clothes that still showed signs of hardware. Children trying to sit still, despite excitement making them want to bounce. 30 students and their families, roughly 200 people total, gathered in a space that probably cost more to rent for an evening than many of them earned in months. The contrast made Marcus acutely aware of the distance they were trying to bridge the gap between the world these families navigated daily and the world that Takahashi Industries represented. Reina took the podium with confidence built over decades of public speaking, but Marcus noticed something different in her bearing tonight. She seemed less guarded, more genuinely present, rather than performing the role of CEO delivering prepared remarks. Education creates possibilities that no circumstance can fully suppress. Her voice carried across the room, amplified by excellent acoustics and the attention of people who understood what was at stake. But access to education remains profoundly unequal, determined more by accidents of birth than by capability or dedication. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces before her. I know this intimately. I was one of you once, the daughter of factory workers serving food to pay for school, told repeatedly that people like me belong doing manual labor, rather than pursuing dreams that seemed too large for our station. The audience shifted, parents leaning forward slightly, recognizing something in her story that resonated with their own experiences. Someone stood up for me eventually, though, not until after I had already spent years struggling alone. And I vowed that if I ever possessed the means, I would create opportunities for others before they had to fight as hard as I did for recognition. Reina looked directly at Marcus, then acknowledging his presence in the second row. But I had forgotten that vow, had let success corrupt the values I once held, until someone reminded me at considerable personal cost what it meant to choose dignity over convenience. She returned her attention to the families. This foundation exists because Marcus Hall refused to let my cruelty stand unchallenged, because he demonstrated that intelligence and moral courage exist independent of economic circumstances, and because I was fortunate enough that his courage gave me an opportunity to remember who I used to be before wealth made me forget. The first name was called Maria Gonzalez, 16 years old, Bronx, teaching herself Japanese through sheer determination. The girl stood with tears already streaming down her face, walked to the front on shaking legs, received her certificate with trembling hands. The second name followed. Ahmed Hassan, 14 years old, Queens. 4 languages spoken at home, hunger to learn more. His parents stood as he walked forward, pride radiating from their expressions in ways that transcended language. One by one, the names were called, and students walked forward, each one representing potential that circumstance had tried to bury but hadn't quite managed to kill. Their faces showed emotion ranging from shock to joy to disbelief, the particular expressions of people receiving opportunities they had hoped for but never quite believed would materialize. Marcus watched them all, seeing himself at various ages in their faces, remembering what it felt like to be smart and poor and uncertain whether intelligence mattered when measured against the brutal mathematics of poverty. He thought about Sarah, who would have loved this, who had believed fiercely in the power of education to transform lives. When the last name was called and the final certificate awarded, Reina returned to the podium. These 30 students represent just the beginning. The Marcus Hall Scholarship Foundation will continue growing, will reach more students, will create more opportunities. Because talent and capability are distributed equally, but opportunity is not. And addressing that inequality is both moral imperative and practical investment in our collective future. The families applauded the sound, filling the ballroom with genuine enthusiasm. Marcus found himself standing without having consciously decided to stand, joining the ovation not for Reina, but for the students, for what this moment represented. After the ceremony concluded and families departed with their certificates and information packets, Reina found Marcus standing alone by the windows looking out at the city. Thank you, she spoke quietly, coming to stand beside him, for refusing to let me be the person I had become, for giving me the chance to be better. You did the hard part, fighting the board, maintaining commitment through months of resistance. I just asked for it. You asked for it knowing I might refuse, knowing it might cost you the job. That took courage I'm not sure I possessed anymore until you showed me what it looked like. Marcus turned to face her directly. I've watched you carefully these 3 years, watched how you treat staff, how you handle disagreements, how you respond when things don't go your way. You've kept your word in ways that go beyond what our agreement strictly required, because you were right. Raina's expression carried something that might have been peace. Dignity isn't for sale, and wealth doesn't grant permission to treat people as less than human. Those are truths I knew once and forgot, and you reminded me at the exact moment I needed reminding. They stood together in companionable silence, two people who had somehow navigated from confrontation to something resembling genuine partnership. Daddy Lily's voice cut through the moment. She had been allowed to attend the ceremony, had watched the proceedings with wide-eyed attention. "Can we get ice cream now?" "You promised." Marcus smiled, grateful for her interruption, for the way children anchored abstract concepts in concrete pleasures. Ice cream, the most important business of any evening. He took her hand and turned toward the exit, pausing at the doorway to look back at Raina. Monday, Monday. She smiled, a genuine expression, free of calculation or performance. "Enjoy your ice cream." They walked together into the evening, father and daughter navigating Manhattan streets toward a shop Lily favored. The temperature had dropped with sunset November air, carrying the first hints of winter approaching. Marcus pulled Lily's jacket tighter around her shoulders, and she accepted the adjustment without complaint. The ice cream shop glowed with warm light, cases displaying exotic flavors that tourists photographed before ordering. Lily studied the options with the seriousness of someone making consequential decisions, eventually selecting something involving caramel and chocolate, and probably too much sugar for this close to bedtime. They sat at a small table by the window, eating ice cream and watching people pass on the sidewalk outside. New York flowed around them in its endless circulation, millions of individual stories intersecting briefly before diverging towards separate destinations. "What was it like?" Lily's question came between bites of ice cream. "When you were my age, I mean. You didn't have much money, right?" Marcus considered how to answer, wanting honesty without burdening her with fears she didn't need to carry. "It was hard sometimes. My parents worked a lot like I used to. We didn't have money for extras. But we had each other, and we had books from the library, and I learned that knowledge was something nobody could take away." "Is that why you teach me Japanese, so I'll have something nobody can take away?" "Partly, but mostly because you're good at it, and developing talents makes life richer even when life is difficult." Lily absorbed this, her face thoughtful. "I'm glad things are better now. I like our apartment. I like my school. I like that you're home for dinner." "Me too, baby girl. Me too." They finished their ice cream and walked home through streets that had grown quieter as the evening aged. Their building appeared ahead, windows glowing with the lives contained in apartments, stacked vertically, all these people existing in parallel, occasionally intersecting, but mostly maintaining separate orbits. Upstairs, Lily changed into pajamas and brushed her teeth with the efficiency of someone ready for sleep. Marcus tucked her in, the ritual unchanged despite everything else that had transformed over 3 years. "I love you, Daddy." Her voice carried drowsiness words, slurring slightly as exhaustion won its battle against consciousness. "I love you too. More than all the words in all the languages in the world. Even more than in Japanese. Even more than in Japanese." She smiled and closed her eyes, her breathing slowing towards sleep. Marcus watched her for a moment, this child who had been his reason for enduring when endurance seemed impossible, who had given him purpose when purpose felt lost. He thought about the evening, about 30 students receiving opportunities they had earned but couldn't access without help. About Raina fighting board meetings for 11 months to keep a promise she could have broken. About the strange path from that private dining room to this moment, how confrontation had somehow birthed transformation. People often said that dignity was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. But Marcus had learned something different through his journey from Lumiere to Takahashi Industries, from poverty to stability, from submission to standing firm. Dignity didn't depend on money or status or the opinions of people who thought they were better. It depended entirely on whether you possessed the courage to claim it when the world tried hardest to strip it away. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person others underestimated most turned out to be the one capable of changing everything. Marcus turned out Lily's light and moved toward his own room, carrying the weight of a day that felt significant beyond its individual moments. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to build on what they had created. But tonight he would sleep peacefully, knowing that the choice he had made 3 years ago had led somewhere worth going, somewhere that honored both the girl he used to be and the man he had become. Somewhere that created possibilities for others who needed them the way he had once needed them. Somewhere that proved redemption was possible, even for those who seemed least deserving of it. The city hummed outside his windows, 8 million stories unfolding simultaneously. And in this small apartment, in a better neighborhood than he once could have imagined, affording Marcus Hall closed his eyes and let sleep come, grateful for the journey and curious about where it might lead next.